So today we are going to talk about not a system design question, but a product design question called localization service. Localization service is one of my most favorite question because the breadth of the question where it can covers a lot of stuff and also the depth of the things that we can cover. And that's why this question can cover like evaluations for software engineers all the way from like mid-level all the way until like principal levels and above, right? So that's why I really like these questions. But first off, let's talk about like what is the question itself? What is localization service? So let's imagine that you have an app, right? Let's, take any app. But for convenient purpose, let's take Facebook, right? Facebook, like for example, you have like this content here, right? Content and some kind of text below, right? And then below that content, you see like some actions like, comment, and share. And then the thing here, the requirement is, let's imagine that like this is kind of like the default UI, right, of Facebook app. But say that you are coming from Indonesia, right? And then, this is like the locale of this particular app is in English, right? In the particular user is English. But if you are seeing it in Indonesian, right? Or you change your locale, right, from English to Indonesia, like the text here, the text that is generated by the user will not change, right? What is going to change is the text that is, given by the app itself, right? So all the static text will change, but all the dynamic user-generated content will not change, right? So this will become like suka, and then komentar, and then this, right? So this is the Indonesian translations of like, comment, and share. So this is basically like the gist of like what localization service requirement is, right? Now, let's get started. Let's actually try to answer this question. And as usual, just like how we do like system design, again, as I mentioned, product design, how you answer product design will be very, very similar with system design, right? First, you start with functional requirement. And then when we are answering functional requirement, just like system design, right, the best way to answer functional requirement is in a form of user stories. Why? I'll explain a little bit. So first off is what we should be aware of is that like, okay, the requirement is that like when users see like, for example, in the local ID, right, it should see the static text as translated. So let's write that. As a user, when I open Facebook app, I see the static text translated into my chosen locale, which means I can choose my locale as well. I can change my locale. Cool. So going back to like why it is important to write the functional requirement in a form of user story. There are two reasons. The first one is the fact that you are explicit about who are the stakeholders here, right? In this case, the stakeholder is the end user. But it's not always going to be the case, which I'm going to show you in a little bit. And the second one is each of this particular request, right? Each of this particular requirement correspond to at least one API, right? So for example, as a user, when I open FB app, I see static text translate to my chosen locale. This translate into like a get API somewhere, right? As a user, I can change my locale. That means like I'm, making a mutation call to like my preference, right? So this is going to be a post API. And there's going to be like some more of this, right? Which I'm going to elaborate soon. But as you can see there, like by writing it in a form of user stories, this actually really helps on defining like what are the APIs going to be look like. So let's continue like the requirement, right? So now on a glance, like this requirement seems to be complete, but is it really, right? The thing here is that like, let's imagine this particular scenario, right? Like take a look at this like text here, right? Like can means many things, right? Like for example, I like orange, or I can also say I look like orange. The like here and the like here is a bit different, right? And there are many options to actually like translate it properly into this particular text. But one of the things that possibly I can come up with is that like you actually need to at least have like some kind of human QA, right? Or at least or a translator. So it probably cannot be done automatically through machine or 100% through machine. At least you need some kind of QA or translator. So let's pick like a translator role for a while. So as a translator, I can see list of text that I need to translate in my particular language. So imagine that like a translator will be responsible for one language, and they will get a list of like, okay, this is the English. I'm gonna translate it into like its particular language that I understand. Right. So that's one. So you can imagine that this is actually a GET request, right? And then the other one is that like as a translator, I can submit my translation of a particular text of a particular language, right? So that's a translator, right? That is, as you can see now, that the system actually requires two stakeholders, right? One is the end user and the second one is translator. Is that it? No, right? Why? Because like imagine that like you as a developer within Facebook, right? And you are not building the localization service. Say you are building, I don't know, Facebook Pay, Facebook Messenger, right? That is unrelated to this particular text. Then you probably want to, reuse this particular service, right? To translate like pay into like its particular, translation, right? Say, bayar. This is English. This is Indonesia, right? So this means that the engineer itself previously only have to write the code something like this, right? Let's imagine this is on HTML, but they have to do something different, right? It's impossible that they have to, write every single permutations of languages. What they're going to do at least is going to be something like, hey, I'm going to translate pay, and then possibly you add some context, right? Some maybe like a button to stop paying or something, right? So as you can see that the developer actually changed the way they work. So it means the developer is another stakeholder in the system. So let's add it up. As a developer, I can specify which language. I can specify static text in the app and specify which one I want to translate. Okay. And then finally, as a developer, I can request translation for that particular text that I've specified. Cool. So as you can see here, right, you see the power of like writing a user story, because now it is very clear that there are actually three stakeholders here, right? There are three stakeholders that is interacting with the system, and each of them have like each particular API. And this is also the reason why like product design is quite interesting and different from like system design, because like typically the requirement is not going to be that clear, right? And then we actually want to see you spend some time in functional requirement and and uncover the fake requirement, because imagine that like in a product design we actually want to see whether you can actually become a PM, right? To replace your PM if for example they are not there, they are sick, they are on vacation, like can you be the standby PM, right? That's kind of like the gist of like why we are doing product design, right? Let's continue. So non-functional requirement. So I mentioned this in my previous video that like non-functional requirement is actually not that important for product design, but we can probably revisit this later. So I'm just going to add TBA here. So that's with numbers, right? I'm not sure like what numbers is going to be important for this particular system. Is the number of users going to be important? Number of requests, number of read? I don't know, honestly, right? So that's why I'm going to do it later, right? And then I will decide whether like some numbers actually impacted the design that we actually have to build. Let's just jump into the high level design, right? It's the end user, and then we have the translator, and then we have the developer. Cool. Let's put them. So this is end user, translator, developer. Just end user, translator, developer. Let's just draw like, this typical system, right? You have the API gateway where everybody is going to be accessing that. And then you have the, load balancer to make sure the system scale. This is not super important in product design because we are not looking into how you scale a system, right? That's actually part of system design. Product design is more about like how the data flows. And the way that you explain this, like why do you need API gateway, is because API gateway is one central way to actually do authorizations and authentications, and that's why you need API gateway. And from the user perspective, the DNS or the URL they are going to hit is going to be one URL, right? So it's going to be clean, and that's why you need an API gateway. For load balancer, not so important for the purpose of product design, but just putting it here, just kind of like impress the interviewer. And then let's start with the end user, right? Let's say you actually are opening some feed, right? And then when you open the feed, you will get like you open you open some database here, right? Like the feed DB, right? And then it will return them, like for example, given a user, give me like a list of story, right? The thing here in the feed, like there is nothing that we need to translate, right? Because this thing is going to be user generated, right? When they are putting it back into the client, right? The text is actually going to be in the client already, right? Which I'm actually going to talk about like several ideas about here, right? So there are three possible ideas about like giving the translations from the server to the client. The first idea is like for each request translation, right? So in this particular request, right, I'm gonna ask and then like go to feed, and then like on the feed, like I'm gonna go to like say for example another DB here, like a localization service, right? This is one option, but like obviously the pros is gonna be simple, but the cons is it's gonna be quite expensive on the bandwidth and the request, right? So that's one option. The second one is like gonna batch per page. So for example, if there is like a whole page of things that you need to translate, you basically send them up into the server and then like do some request translation. The pros is gonna be faster, less bandwidth consumption. But the cons is gonna be complex, right? Because you need batching. The third one, the option is like when you load the app, right? And why we want to talk about app is because like 90% of Facebook users are actually in mobile. So we want to design for mobile app first and then think about the desktop, application later. When we are talking about mobile, right? Then one idea is actually just translate the whole Facebook app translations at the beginning, right? So when user choose a locale, for example, or user start up the app, you download all the translation of the app, right? Download all translation at the beginning or locale change during the locale change, right? The pros of this is going to be actually quite simple, right? Because like you basically just download the whole database to a particular language to the user, right? But the cons is like going to be the storage consumption on client, which we need to think about like how much storage actually is going to be consumed by the client, right? So I'm leaning toward to go to like the third solution, but I need to think whether like this cons actually is still a cons, right? So now let's go back to quantitative analysis. So I think the number that is important here is like how much text is going to be downloaded, right? So how many like static text is going to be going to access in Facebook app, right? Static text in Facebook app. So this is going to be like maybe 50,000, right? Where like each text is going to be 1 kilobyte. So this means that like you are for every single translation batching request, you are going to be requesting and storing 50 megabytes of data ish, right? Which is very, very it makes sense, right? It's not massive, right? And then at any given time, you probably don't want to download multiple languages. You probably at most downloading 2 or 3 languages, right? So at most, yeah, you might be downloading 150 megabytes, right? So for majority of use cases, except for like, places with like, low end phone or like bad bandwidth, this might not make sense, but like these numbers actually is very reasonable, right? So honestly, I'm gonna just go with like the third approach. So, choice uh, 0.3. And this is actually one of the core puzzle of the localization service. Like how exactly are you gonna do the translation, right? How are you going to store it? Which is like this. This download translation is one of the core puzzle in localization service. Okay, let's move on. So load balancer gonna feed to DB. You get a list of story, but the translation is actually gonna happen on the client. And this means that because we choose like 0.3, the first thing that you are gonna do is actually requesting to translation package service, and then this is gonna go to like localization DB, right? Um, and then it's gonna request here. I'm gonna say that like, hey, I am requesting the language equals to Indonesia, and then they give me like 50 megabytes of 50 megabytes of Indonesian language. We can probably think about how to scale this with like CDN and whatnot, but like I mean we can think about that later, right? So this means the end user itself, when they are requesting the feed, it's going to be like a simple API of GET. Not going to go through that that particular request because it's not that important for the system. But like I need to think about like what are kind of requests that we are requesting to localization DB. So this is going to be a GET and then language package, and then this is going to be like language equal to something, right? Or even better, if we want to if you want to support some kind of caching, a better caching, you can do like something like this. The request is going to contain the out token. The response is going to contain like 15 megabytes of data. Cool. So this is like the API, right? And then the other thing that we have to actually solve. So I have solved this, right? As you said, I can do this. Okay. As you said, I can change my locale. So let's do this really quick. So I can go to here. Whoops. Okay. I can go here and then like build like user service, and then I'm gonna drop it into like user preference, and then this is gonna be like a post API. Hey, by the way, my language preferred locale equals to Indonesia right here, right? For example, and then like the user will get the database will get back to like, yeah, okay, sure, I accept your changes, and maybe like return the user ID that is being mutated, which means the post API is gonna be user maybe added, right? So I'm just gonna do something like this. So it's gonna be like a mutation to like user preference in general, right? So not just for a particular locale, but it's going to be user preference in general, and locale is going to be one of the preference there. So I'm going to update the locale into ID. Response is going to be user ID. So this is also another important thing that you have to understand here. When you're talking about response, right? Most people will basically think about like, oh, okay, the server will say like, okay, 200, okay, right? But this is kind of like wasteful, right? Sometimes you want to use this response to do some rendering on the client side, show some loading page, or do some kind of polling. So try to get used to just showing like what am I mutating here, right? So it's gonna actually send like the user ID that I'm mutating, right? This is ID or EN or R. while I'm also putting the out token here to identify the particular user that I am mutating. Cool. So that solves this one. Cool. For translator, it's gonna be super straightforward, right? It's gonna be like both like an API translator service. It's gonna be talking to localization DB for both the get and post, right? The get is gonna be like get, hey, I wanna translate, and then the request is gonna be like again out token whether I can actually do translations, and then I need to show like you know, token is string, not UID. Do I have like, yeah, okay. Locale, and then the response is gonna be like, hey, this is the list of string. So please translate this. Actually, I'm gonna just, oh yeah, translation. And then I'm gonna give you an array, and then you know, and this is like how we design the API, right? So again, talking about API is very important in product design because that's basically the gist of product design, right? Which is the logical representation of the system. So let's make this right. So what do I expect from the translator, right? I expect the translator to see like, hey, I have this language, I have this English language that you need to translate. In English text you have to translate. So I'm gonna be like, okay, I have like this, like, please give me like the translation where maybe this is gonna be added by with context, right? And then this is gonna be like, and then if this ID, it's gonna be this, and if I don't have any particle translation, it's gonna be null, right? Now the thing here is that I actually need to only return the Indonesian one, right? And if I wanna give you, if I'm the translator, I only want to see the text that I need to translate. Actually, like me, I'm probably going to show both the text that I need to translate and the text that is already translated, and then let the client side actually do the sorting, right? Maybe I can add some filter here, right, to only show the text that I translated. But for now, I'm going to show both, right? So like, this is comment plus some context. Say, for example, like is translated, but comment is not, right? So in this case, I'll show, oops, this is going to be comment, and then the Indonesian is null, right? So this means that like in the UI, I would expect that the translator will see like, okay, there is the like text, but it is translated already, and there is the comment text that needs to be translated, and then the UI later on can filter out, can have a particular product to filter out like, oh, I only want to show like which one is not translated, right? So that it's easier for the translator. And then the post again can be super straightforward. This is going to be our token filter, and actually I'm just going to give the list of translation here, and then the response is going to be the list of the translations. I'm thinking about whether I want to do mutation one by one or a batch. Let's start with one by one. So I'm gonna just do this one by one, right? And then I'm gonna respond like translation ID equals to some UID, right? And I'm gonna translate this into the actual text. Cool. So you see, translator text use case is very simple. You get and then you post into this particular DB. So this means I have covered this and this. While we are doing this, let's actually talk about like what are we storing in the database itself. So I'm gonna be choosing like MongoDB because you know I don't really need like consistency here, right? There is gonna be least very small amount of write throughput here. There is gonna be a lot of read throughput. So NoSQL DB fits really well here. Availability actually is a requirement here. It's gonna be quite interesting. So actually, like let's put it in one for requirement. In terms of cap theorem, I'm gonna be picking like, you know, eventual consistency, high availability. This means I'm going to be using NoSQL. In this case, probably pick Mongo. Cassandra is fine as well, honestly, but Cassandra is optimized for write, right? So I don't really need a lot of write here, so Mongo is gonna work just fine. What's gonna be in the DB? The DB is gonna be something like this, right? So it's gonna be like, you know, like plus context. This is gonna be the key, and the value is gonna be like all the languages and the translation for that particular. So it's gonna be like locale and then the translation. Obviously start with English. So it's gonna be like, it's gonna be suka. Japanese is gonna be ine, and then you have something else. So this is what you are going to be storing in the database, right? So this is going to be like some kind of key value pair, like a document base, where the key is going to be like the text plus context. Why the context is important? Because we need to know like whether this is, I want to translate I like orange or I look like an orange. So that's the context is very important here. And then the key here is going to be the locale, and then the value is going to be the translation we're actually going to put there. Cool. So we have covered the DB, the API, the data flow of the translator and end user. Let's finally talk about the developer. So as a developer, right, there are many ways that you can actually write the text here, right? The developer API here we can provide. First is that like you do it something like this, right? Where you have like translate, and then you have like, you know, like, and then you have like, this is a button for liking in feed. And then obviously you have like the user context, right? To understand like what is their particular locale, right? This is one option, right? The good thing about this is that, like, it's very intuitive for the developer, right? Because like I can keep writing like here, and I can just keep writing the code as I can keep asking the text that need to be translated as I write the code. This is one option, right? Second one is that like you can actually write some kind of ID, right? So instead, I'm gonna be doing something like this, and then r resource.id resource.translate.string actually, and then like. This is actually the standard for Android, right? Where you actually store the strings in the string XML, and you have like, you know, the particular, you know, language and, you know, language equal ID, or like more like something like this. You have strings XML, you have strings, and then ID.xml, and then you have strings en.xml. The problem with this is that like you actually need to write the string.xml first, right? To generate the ID, right? So the flow of the developer here is gonna be different, right? So you need to generate ID first, and then you code, right? So the second one is actually more a hassle, but remember that we actually already chosen that like we are gonna download all translation at the beginning. And this structure actually fits really well, right? We are going to be just downloading this whole XML file, right? So in that sense, I'm going to be opting for the second solution, right? So I'm going to ask the developer to actually put the ID first, and then, you know, put the ID, and then after that, we are going to be generating this text that is going to be downloaded periodically by the client, right? When things changes. So this means this is going to be the chosen developer API that I'm going to pick. And that happens to solve this as well. Now, finally, like how do I actually request a translation? I guess that's also being solved because like you generate the ID tag, the ID first. It means like there's going to be some kind of UI that, you know, that allows you to, hey, I need translation for this, right? Actually, there is two options, right? Either you put it through UI or you put it to string.xml, and later let the CI/CD tools actually read like which ID that is being newly registered, and that is not being translated yet. Actually, because that is better for his developer experience, I'm gonna do that. So what I'm gonna do is that I'm gonna build like a CI/CD pipeline for this developer, right? So developer is gonna, no, not, they're gonna talk with this API gateway. They're gonna talk with like a CI/CD pipeline, right? So when they commit, the CI/CD pipeline will actually do like a static analysis to the code that they submit and see they're like, oh, there is a new string that new entry in the string.xml. It means that like this developer wanna request for a new translation, right? And the CI/CD pipeline then will request the to translator service and give back like an ID, which is gonna be the ID that is being used in string.xml. So that is fine. This ID is actually gonna be the same translation ID, right? And probably with this, I'm gonna need like some kind of translation ID, something, right? And let's see here, like developer write the code and say they're like, okay, I need to translate this particular text. They put the the r.strings.like that currently doesn't have ID, but the string.xml see they're like, oh, this particular string doesn't have ID yet. Okay, let me request to the translation service, and then the CI/CD will then complete the code with like the new XML with the new ID and put it inside the XML with autogen. So it needs to be like some kind of autogen here. And after that, subsequently, when some user is when the string is not translated yet, it's gonna be requested by the translator. The translator will translate it later. Put the translation inside the server, inside the localization DB. Once that is being translated, then finally the end user will download this whole XML file to the client when they start up the app. So that's the whole flow. That's localization service. So yeah, as you can see that like the non-functional requirement that I talk about is quite small. I don't really talk about quantitative analysis. I cover massively about API, data schema, and data flow, but that's not the only thing, right? It's not the point of product design is not just about API and data schema, right? The product flow, like how each of the stakeholders interact with the system, is actually very important, right? The end user here will interact with a mobile phone, right, with their particular Facebook app. The translator will interact with a CMS UI. The developer is not going to even interact with the API gateway. They're going to talk directly to CI/CD when they are developing the code. So that's something that you have to keep in mind. And again, just like system design, don't forget about the core puzzle. In this case, there are two core puzzles, right? The first one is how do you actually get the translations to the user here, right? And the second one is like how do we provide the developer API to the developer, just like this. So that's it. It's product design for you. And hopefully this is useful to give you some insights about like how system design is different from product design. But otherwise, stay coding.